First of all, I'd like to say how privileged I am to be able to speak to you and lead you in this recollection today. I admire your group. I admire your society. My first contact, my regular contact is through Anthony Case and Peter Judge. But my first contact was when I was back in Hobart, back in between 95 and 2005. And the society used to come in with, I'd say truckloads, but van loads of children to our 9:30 Mass of a Sunday. They'd always arrive late because we always started right on time. But the parishioners themselves were so impressed with all these young children coming in from Warrane and from Bridgewater and just coming in and sharing the Eucharist with them. And it made a really deep impression on the parishioners themselves. But what impressed me was you fellas. And sitting and looking at the life you lead, the spirituality you hold to, I couldn't do that. And to realise that I come in a pastor's congregation, a religious order, priesthood, and in one way my life and my ministry is, to use the word, secure. When I went in, I knew what I was going into. I never wanted to be a diocesan priest. Didn't want to be one, I ended up being a parish priest. But for me, this focus was on living community, and through community, the presence of Christ can be brought into our world. But when I look at yourselves and your society, you don't have the canonical comforts that we might have. You're not a religious order in one sense, and you're kind of canonically sort of on the fringes. You're sort of in a laity, but you're not. There's a whole sense of being. And in one way, if you look back, you all might say you're ahead of your time. We're at a time now in the church where we're exploring again religious life and priesthood and ministry, how lay involvement can occur in a more abundant way than what it is at the moment. But our canon law at times ties us up so we can't move into places that we want to and express the ministries in the ways that we would like to. But for each of you, you have been called into a community and a way of life and ministry which doesn't have the comforts of predictability. The number of times people ask you, you're not a religious order, you're not a religious, or who are you? What? It's like last night's gospel when the scribes and Pharisees, they sent their disciples along to John and asked, who are you? We want to know about you. Now tell us what you do. And John the Baptist tells them what he's not. And they say, yes, but we want to know who you are. And if you're not Elijah and these, then why are you doing these things? And I'm sure you're pretty much like John the Baptist, where people come and tell us, who are you, what are you, and why are you doing these things? And if you're not a priest, and if you're not a religious, and if you're not a this, and you're not a that, therefore explain yourself. And maybe that there's a point of reflection today. How do you explain yourself to other people? What are the words, what are the stories, what is the picture you create that enables people to say, that is what they're about. Now for me, I see a band, I'll see some children, and I'll see a church, and I'll say, the society's there. They're your symbols. That's kind of from outside what you look to. And then I meet each one of you, and you all bring your own personality, your own background, your own character. You bring your own calling to form the community out of which all of you work. But I admire you do ministry, you live community life, you hold down regular employment, you have all sorts of broader enriched sources of enrichment that you bring to your work and to each other. And as I say, I admire and marvel at you, because it's something that I find it very hard just to stick with what I'm doing without having a lot of other commitments on top of that, like regular work. But it's a sense in which where you are and what you're promoting may be where the future of our church and ministry does go. There is a harmony between being lay and also performing the ministries that we would associate fairly much with the formed religious orders and with priesthood. So my first statement to you is, I admire you. Okay. For our point of recollection today, I was going through the material that John gave me or emailed to me just before Christmas, and I could get caught up in all the regulations. You know, this person does this and this does that, but that tells me how you function. But who are you again as people, as a religious community, as a community of God? And what struck me was the title on one of the documents that simply said, "If the Lord does not build the house, in vain do the workers toil." And then thumbing through and reading through all the other documentation, I still kept coming back to that statement. If the Lord does not build the house, in vain do the workers toil. And our point of reflection then, and moving into the days of meeting and sharing, is that recognising the Lord is present. And so the lighting of the candles is an external sign of what I believe is in our hearts. The Lord is present to each of us, and it's that heart within that reflects the presence of the Lord to those around us and ultimately to the wider world. When Mother Teresa of Calcutta was over in Australia, it would have been back in about 1974, I think it was, or 73, and she was in Melbourne at the MCG and walking around with her sisters. And the story goes, in our own tradition of our province, is that one of our brothers, Brother Damien Byrne, took the courage and went up to Mother Teresa and said, "Mother, I want to thank you very much for the good work you do." And she said, "Oh, but brother, it's all his work." And he turned around and said, "Who is he?" In other words, Mother Teresa was talking that all the work she was doing was the work of God. Whereas what Damien was doing was saying to her, "You do a wonderful job." And so she was saying, "No, it's not me who does the work, it's God working through me." And for ourselves too, to recognise that it's not me doing the work, it's God working through me. So with this theme in my mind of unless the Lord does not build the house, in vain does the labourers toil, I became aware that around Hobart there's a lot of building going on. And some of it's going on so fast that it even leads to a few disasters. We've got M.U.S.E.U.M. M.U.S.E.U.M building got burnt down back in 2007. And M.U.S.E.U.M were always going to rebuild. Well, they decided they would rebuild and started midway through last year. They're building over what we call the rivulet, which is a main water course that goes under Hobart. And they've had to dig down in order they're going to put a 6 or 7 story hotel on top of the store. In Hobart, everyone's building hotels. So they're starting to build this, but they actually damaged the rivulet. And then one night, in a torrent, very heavy rainstorms, the water came down and burst its banks. So the excavation that they dug was full of water. And therefore, as the water swirled around, it carved out under the neighbouring building. And so cat and fiddle shops started to slide downwards. So it's a whole sense of, if a building is done correct, it works. But if you don't do all that you should do, then you're going to have a little bit of catastrophe. And of course, when the investigations took place, whose fault was it? Well, it's everyone's fault, but nobody's fault. And then the bureaucrats got involved and they found that certain forms hadn't been signed off on. So perhaps because the forms hadn't been signed, that's why the collapse took place. But anyway, it's the sort of sense of the building, if it goes according to the master plan, will achieve its aim. There's a hotel being built just up from our church in Macquarie Street there. And I'll sometimes walk up the other side of Macquarie Street and watch it. And I've never actually watched a building gradually progress. And it all starts outside when a truck pulls up with great big slabs of concrete wall. And there's a crane and there's all these guys lift it all up and put it into place. So if the man who receives those items of building material down on the ground floor, if they don't go up in right order, it means that building is not going to be what it should. And in point of fact, if it doesn't go up in right order, they've got to take it all down and put it back up again. So there has to be some persons who have a master plan as to how that building should be, and have an idea as to how it should be, how it's going to be constructed. In one way, your theme of itself, if the Lord does not build a house, in vain do the workers toil. We have to at times sit back and allow the master builder, the master architect, the master planner to have to sit with him and talk to him so he can explain to us just what our role is in the building of the church. The building of the church, the universal church. Because we might think that our role is to build the whole lot, whereas our role is to respond as part of a team, as part of a community. So our words and our deeds are actually the words and deeds of God, of Christ, because they are working in the master plan. It's almost like the cathedral in Cologne. It took 900 years to build. Well, you can imagine the guys laying the foundation stone and then trying to imagine what it would look like when it was completed 900 years down the track. But every generation did their bit, recognising that they weren't actually called to put the final stone in place, but they were called to ensure that what they contributed was solid and firm. And then over the 900 years we finally got the spires built. But also then to recognise that what we're about in our own religious community, in our own communities, is that we aren't the end product. In point of fact, all of us hope and desire that what we are doing and the way we are living life is shared with another group, another generation. And for us in the moment, this can become a point of despair because we don't see, in many cases, another generation coming on. And therefore, what do we do? Do we down tools and go away and say, well, that was a waste of time? Or do we continue to do what we are doing faithfully, recognising that while our numbers might be reduced, the strength of and the fidelity with which we live our life is always there. In point of fact, we can become more faithful and stronger in what we do because we haven't recognised we haven't got those to bear the load, and we start to take on more, sometimes more than we should. But the whole sense of listening to the master architect speak to us and following out his designs for us as individuals and also his designs for us as a society, a community within the church. I've given to you two scripture passages as a point of reflection, but they're there for taking on afterwards. They're to do with, in one sense, with the first one's to do with building. And I've taken it from Luke's Gospel. And Luke's talking about true discipleship. And Luke says that everyone who comes to me and listens to my word and acts upon them, I will show them what he is like. He is like a man who, when he built his house, he dug and dug deep and laid foundation on rock. When the river was in flood, it bore down on the house, but it could not shake it. It was so well built. But the one who listens and does nothing is like the man who built his house on soil with no foundations. As soon as the river bore down on it, it collapsed, and what a ruin that house became. In one sense, that we ask the Lord to build our house, or enable us to build on strong foundations. And the strong foundations are set by you as a group. not by one individual. And it's a group that claims that this is the basis upon which we work. This is the basis upon which we live. And so together we lay claim to that, and together we support each other in that. So the house that's built on solid foundations requires a very long preparation. As a person dug, and he dug deep. So in digging and digging deep, we dig and we look at what is it that we've got to contribute. What are the gifts that God's given us in order to enable us to be an effective part of the society. We are the ones who name the gifts we have, but sometimes we need others also to name those gifts, because some people see our talents and our capacities in a different light than we actually do ourselves. Sometimes we become so aware of our limitations, we don't always see the strengths and the gifts in which we are able to use and use effectively. So in one way, as a point of reflection, you can use the image of you being built, of your society being built and being created. You can go back to the foundation stones of your founder, or you can go back to the foundation stones of your own calling. Your calling came from, I'm not sure, but I'll try it out. And then gradually your commitment grows and grows. And as you get older, your commitment becomes more solidified. I'm not talking about becoming flexible, because that's the other catch with becoming a foundation stone. You never move, but you have to be a foundation stone, but at the same time be flexible, so that you can move as the building develops. The tallest skyscrapers in the world are always moving. There's some that actually, there's one big skyscraper in France that has almost a pendulum in the middle of it, and it moves. So when the winds blow, the pendulum keeps it straight. And you think, well, you look at it and you think, if that moves, it's going to fall. But it has to move so that it doesn't fall. And so in our own development of life too, we need to be able to have that kind of pendulum within us that enables us to move with the time and move with the demands. Because if we remain very, very straight and solid and inflexible, well, then we will collapse, because the atmosphere around us will just pressure us to fall. So even with our own life and our own commitment, to realise that we need to be flexible, we need to be inquiring. We need to have an inquiring mind, to listen to what others say, to reflect on what's been said, and also then to be able to respond to it. Some people are very good listeners, but they don't respond very well, because they think, what I've got to say, it doesn't seem important. But every word, every response we have is important, particularly when we're talking about the things of God. Because the Spirit of God is contained, and the wisdom of God is contained in each one of us. And if we fail to speak, even though we might think it sounds silly, if we fail to speak in one way, we're not open to the Word of God, and we're not open to share that Word with others. It's when we speak the Word that the Word becomes flesh in our world. And so in that sense, if you want to, we are like Mary. The Word becomes flesh because it's first received into us. And if we're afraid of making a fool of ourselves, well, God chose the weak in order to confound the strong. So that's what we're told. When we look at our weakness or our frailties, and that's often out of which we work. God chose David as a little shepherd boy to become king of Israel. When all the other sons had been passed over, no, these aren't the ones I choose. And then you've got one more year since David out in the field. He's looking after the sheep. We'll bring him in, and he's the one that becomes the chosen, the one, the king. Not because of anything else other than he is the smallest, he's the youngest, and also in one sense, he's the one who still has the capacity to grow and develop, whereas perhaps the older brothers didn't. So the story of Luke can be expanded in that way. The other gospel passage there is the story of the road to Emmaus. The road to Emmaus is, I think, a very lovely story. It's packed with the image, and it's packed with application to ourselves. We all know the story. It's the story of two disciples leaving Jerusalem and going to Emmaus. Now, they've built their hopes and desires and their future on this man called Jesus. And that Jesus has been killed. He's been crucified. And so what has happened in their minds is the plan that they had, the master plan, has been fraught with difficulty. In fact, it's collapsed. And so Jesus promised them so much. And as the story itself says there, you must be the only person staying in Israel who does not know the things that have happened these last days. And Jesus says to them, what things? And they say, all about Jesus of Nazareth, they answered, who proved he was a great prophet by the things he said and did in the sight of God and of the whole people, and how our chief priests and our leaders handed him over to be sentenced to death and had him crucified. And then the statement comes, our own hope had been that he would be the one to set Israel free. And so all of a sudden Jesus is a failure because he died. Our hope had been that he was the one to set Israel free. But because their image of Jesus setting Israel free was the big political military leader who was going to throw the Romans out, who was going to recreate the kingdom of Israel, and suddenly they were going to become the people of God in a very political and geographical and national sense. And so when Jesus died, then suddenly the plan had been lost, and there was nobody to support Jesus. And so we've got the group of disciples when Jesus has died in the upper room, if you want, and then these two go off. You know, well, we're going back home because it's not much use sitting here with you group. And Peter, in John's Gospel, he goes along and he says, well, I'm going fishing. And the others say, oh, we'll go with you. And so the group of the community that Jesus has brought together while he was with them, and they're impressed by the words he said and the signs he worked, suddenly when he wasn't with them in a physical form, suddenly everything seemed to come apart. The community started to break up. And so the risen Lord had to go around and bring them all back together again. And so these two are on their way to Emmaus, and they're walking along, and they're dejected. Their heart is very, very heavy with grief and sorrow. They feel as though they've been betrayed. And Jesus comes along and he starts to listen to what they've got to say. He senses their grief, their anguish, their despair, their lack of direction. And the reason because their hope had been lost. And then Jesus starts to take them back over the master plan. He goes back to the prophets, he goes back to the Old Testament and all the statements that were made and brings them through. At times we can also be in that situation. We have hopes and we have great plans. And we say, God would be pleased if this happened. But would God be pleased, or would we be the ones who've been pleased? You know, and we can kind of put our false hopes on things that are very much of this earth. And when we have hopes and desires and plans, to bring them to the Lord and allow the Lord to reveal to them whether they are in keeping with the master plan. And the master plan we can find within the scriptures themselves. And so when Jesus speaks to them and then he makes to go on, Jesus doesn't force himself on these two disciples. He's ready to move on, but they invite him to come and stay the night with him. And it's when he's in the room with them and sharing the meal and he breaks the bread that they recognise him. And then we're told he disappears. All Jesus has to do is break the bread. And that's all. And they recognise straight away that this is the Lord, and the plan that we had invested our time and energies and years in trying to achieve, that plan has not been lost. In fact, the Lord is present to us even when we do not see him. So straight away they go back to Jerusalem. But notice the question, the statement they make, didn't our hearts burn within us as he spoke to us on the journey. And in one sense, our hearts burn within us when we become aware of the presence of the Lord amongst us. And sometimes we can be in a hopeless situation, we can be anxious and despairing, but to allow a moment of quiet where the Lord can come to us. And what seemed a very despairing situation actually became a cause of revival of our faith. But it's in the statement, didn't our hearts burn within us? For me, it just encapsulates what it is to discover the Lord again. And that's what the disciples did. And so they went back and met up with the disciples, and they said, yes, we've found that too. He has appeared to Peter and he's appeared to some of our women. So the one act of Jesus was to go and reassemble the community. And so the community in a sense of building is very important. A sense of teamwork, a sense of being able to enable each person to contribute from the talents that God has given us. If we're building a building, we can't all be electricians because we've got no one to do the plumbing. We can't all be carpet layers if no one's going to lay the floor. But so each of us has a different capacity. And then we bring that along, and then when it's all put together by the architect and by the master builder, when it's all put together, then people can marvel at what has been done. And ultimately we ask that the Lord may enable us to be part of that plan, so the Lord can marvel what is being done through us. So the disciples, as I say, went away from Jerusalem, disheartened, disillusioned, but when they went back full of hope. And their hope and their joy and their movement of heart was such that the other disciples could also resonate with that. And say, yes, it is true. It is true. Hope and despair can be part of our lives. Hope and I think we vacillate, we move between one and the other. I simply say hope is not wishful thinking that operates in the realm of imagination and belief. But hope requires effort, requires dedication, it requires a desire to move into the future, it requires a decision of what might be. So hope is not wishful thinking, I wish this would happen, or I wish that would happen, or I wish that person would go away, or I wish this headache would leave me. You can sit there and wish for a lot of things, but unless you actually put those wishes into action, actually move them into something positive, well then it might be like a little child, sort of wishing Father Christmas would come quicker. Hope is not just wishful thinking. Hope requires effort. So when we talk of faith, hope and charity, we talk of faith as the courage to believe, and charity is the courage to live out the Word of God. And sometimes it's hard to fathom out what hope is. But hope has to be worked at. It has to be encouraged. It has to be fostered. It's like the disciples' heart burning within them. The sign of the heart is a sign of love. But the sign of the heart burning within them is also that the sign of hope. That yes, that they have about to move into a new way of being, a new relationship with God. And so we have stories of hope. There's a story of Viktor Frankl, who was a psychiatrist, and he was a Jew, and he was in Germany in the Second World War, and he and his family were put into the concentration camp. And so he was in one camp, his wife was in another. And he made the observation that the people who survived the camps in one way were not the strong and the really muscular, physically healthy persons, but rather those who depended upon what you would call their psychological health. That the ones who were strong were broken down easily because their physical strength could not sustain them when things got very tough. But he said people who developed a sense of future, who developed a sense of their own self-worth, independent of the environment in which they were in, they were the ones that could actually move forward. And they might have been physically unprepared for the stress and the strain and the anxiety of the concentration camps. He said, but often, if people had a reason to live, well then they gradually moved. As he said, when we are no longer able to change the situation, we are challenged to change ourselves. So we can change everything out there. You can change your room. You can change the positioning of things in the church, and you can say, I wonder why things aren't right, because you're changing everything out there except the thing that matters. And sometimes the change has to be required from within us. And if we change from within, then we can live in any situation. But we live in hope. So he also says, those who have a why to live can bear almost any how. If you have a reason to live, you will be surprised at what you can achieve. Back in October, an elderly man came to the monastery and he wanted me to plan with him his funeral. And he had throat cancer. He chose not to have a throat operation because he wanted to be able to speak right through to the end. And so, but he wanted to know exactly what was going to happen at his funeral. It was going to be a private funeral, so he knew who was going to be there. The funeral wasn't to be in St Joseph's Church, although he loved the church. It was to be in a crematorium chapel, because the people he invited weren't all Catholics and he felt they might be out of place. But he was going to be buried just 600 metres down from the chapel with his mum and dad. He wanted to know, could he have a crucifix in the chapel? Could he have a picture of Our Lady in the chapel? Would there be a candle lit in the chapel? Now that's right, Father. Now, what readings were we going to have? And so he gave me all the readings he wanted, what music was going to be played. And I said, well, I'm going on an 8-day retreat, so you might have died between now and then. Well, I won't. And so 8 days came, and I rang, and no, he was still alive, and he was to go into Whittle Ward. Whittle Ward here is a palliative care place where people go on their last days. And so I rang, and he was just about to go into the Whittle Ward. That was fine. I said, now, I'm going on 10 days holiday. If I don't see you, I'll bid you farewell. I came back from holidays, Christmas, and no, he's still in the Whittle Ward. And the doctors for the week, and he was laughing. He said, the doctors at the end of the week would say, well, we're saying goodbye now because you probably won't be here on Monday. And he took great delight being alive and well and good, because on Monday. So he was, he told me, I've got one niece. He said, I've got a niece who's coming from Melbourne next Monday and I want to see her. And I said, and that's probably the last. He said, it might be the last. And so the niece came and saw him, and I saw him afterwards, and he just said, yeah, that's probably right now. And then we said our prayers and the blessings, and then I left the Tuesday, and then the Wednesday I was going to go to visit him again, and the hospital rang and said, he died at 6:30 on the Wednesday morning, and the family gathered, would you be able to come? And we gathered, and we said the prayers of the dead then. But he was in total organising mode all the way through to the moment of his death. And then when we had the funeral, it was exactly as he had ordered it. Mm-hmm. But the notion of it, he had a reason to keep on, and he had a reason, one thing, even that he was going to plan his funeral so that it kept him alive and engaged. And it was yes, he knew exactly who was going to be. I said to the people, he probably knows exactly where each of you are going to sit. But it's that sense of having a reason to live, and suddenly we can perform extraordinary things. This man kept alive because he had a reason to live. And then when everything was at the appropriate moment, that's when he died. So to have a reason why, and for those who have a why to live, can bear almost any how. And then finally, there's a story of a fellow called Terry Fox. He was a young boy, 26 years of age, I think. He was from Canada, and he was a great athlete, basketball and long distance athletics. And he developed cancer, and he had to they amputated his leg below the knee. But while he was receiving the treatments, he decided that his athletic career hadn't finished, and what he wanted to do was run across Canada from east to west. And people thought he was mad and tried to talk him out of it, but he wanted to raise money because when he was going for treatments, a lot of people around him he found had no hope. They would have the treatments, but it wouldn't succeed because they couldn't see beyond their illness. And he decided he wanted to see beyond the illness, so he decided that's what he was going to do. He was going to run it right across Canada and raise money for cancer research. And so he started out, and he ran, it was for 143 days, and he ran 5,373 kilometres, and he never finished the race. He didn't finish the journey. During that time, he developed lung cancer and had to stop because of the lack of incapacity to breathe properly, and then he died not long after the marathon stopped. But from that point on, every year the marathon is run, and it's called the Marathon of Hope. In one way, Terry Fox's story can be also ours, is that his story of hope is inspirational to others. For he has given his suffering and his death significance and meaning. In many ways, all of us have similar inspirational stories. It can be stories of our family, of the friends. It can be stories that were picked up from the newspaper. Sometimes the Saturday, Sunday newspapers, while they're full of rubbish, sometimes they're also full of very good personal stories. And you can pick them up, you can read them, and you can say, yes, that can be me, or they inspire you to greatness. So in our time of reflection, to be able perhaps to pick up some of those stories and allow them to speak with you, so that your hope and your for the days ahead, these days of meeting, may be based on foundations that are real to you. So at the moment in our reflection is to sort of seek out those stories and those engagements that have given you hope, so that that hope is also becomes part of your prayer and reflection this day. So in one sense, just in a quick summary, the theme I've taken is the theme of unless the if the Lord does not build the house, in vain do the labourers toil. To recognise that we are gathered together to build the house of God. But each of us bring our own contributions, our own personalities, our own skills. As we build a house, sometimes things go awry, like the building of M.U.S.E.U.M, and the foundations get weakened. And then we can lose hope. If we stay in that loss of hope, well then nothing happens, and the community itself starts to break apart. But if the things do go wrong, we have the community that gathers together and restores its hope again. And that's the story of the resurrection. The disciples as a community lost hope when Jesus died. Jesus came and brought them back together when they realised that they hadn't appreciated the master plan. And so for yourselves in your own reflection, your own meeting the next few days, you're starting to look at the master plan, not what necessarily you want, but trying to be in touch with what God wants for you, in the way God will touch your hearts and your ministries to allow you to speak to the church as it is this day, but also to a future generation. And I'll go back to my initial comment about yourselves as a group of people, as that maybe in your own way you are setting a model for the way in which groups will respond in faith to the gospel message in years to come. Because being a religious, being a priest, in one way my life and that is safe, and it's got its problems and needs a lot of hope at the moment, but there's a certain people understand me when I say I'm a religious and a priest. But when you have to say, now, who are you? And then you have to describe yourself, and that can be the challenge, because in some ways you can't say, oh, I'm just a religious like the Franciscans, because that's not you. But you can't say, I'm like this, because that's not true. And then you kind of got, how do you describe yourself? Do you describe yourself by what you do? Or do you describe yourself by the presence of God? That in some way it calls you together and creates a community of people who build the house of God. So just let that be your source of reflection today. On the blue sheet, I have the reflection. I also included there the prayer of St Francis, because in one way that's a statement of the master plan, and maybe to even to encapsulate or to gather together some of those statements as a model for yourselves, at least as a source of reflection. So that's why that prayer is there. It's just that it's a statement of the master plan, if you wish, as envisaged by the Franciscans. We now move into a time of quiet, and we gather back here at quarter to 12, and to again wander around the property, or wherever you're going to find your own peace and quiet. I'll be in the front room there, if anyone wants to come and have a chat at any stage. And there's tea and coffee and that if you want to get a cup of tea or coffee at any point in your quiet time. There won't be any feedback from you in relation to your own reflections. We leave that as your own personal reflection. However, there may be times where you might want to share with a group or share with others as the days unfold.